Hello, my name is Nick Kyriacou, and this is my multimedia presentation for the President's class in our second essay. Essentially, what my essay details is mainly I'm looking at America's racial divide, and because of this racial divide, a lot of African American communities experience this double standard of protection and justice, and this white oppression and white racism. So what I'm going to do here in my multimedia presentation is to kind of expand a little bit on this racial divide and kind of go into some of the statistics very briefly to give us a general overview of what this divide really means today. So the first question is, what is the divide? And I think there are really three main aspects of America's racial gap between blacks and whites. These aspects manifest themselves in an economic divide, an educational divide, and a sharp divide in the criminal justice system. Okay, so let's ask the question of where did this all come from? So in 1968, to address a lot of race riots that had been happening across America, this National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, they undertook a federal study nationwide, and their report that was published in 1968 brought to light the serious gap between many African American communities and their white counterparts. The report concluded that our nation is moving towards two societies, one black, one white, but separate and unequal. And then really one of the most alarming quotes from this report, which is, I'm just going to say it, it was, "White society is deeply implicated in the ghetto. White institutions created it, white institutions maintain it, and white society condones it." And then really across the board, we see that blacks suffer as compared to their white counterparts. The report listed a whole slew of, I think, about 12 total items that needed to be addressed, and just to list them, there were police practices, underemployment and unemployment, so economic issues, inadequate housing, inadequate education, discriminatory administration of justice, and then inadequate grievances and ineffectiveness in the political structure. Okay, so now that we've kind of got a little glimpse about what the report says, we can kind of get a general idea of what the conditions were like back in the 60s. Let's look at how they are today. So what I have here on the right is a chart of unemployment rates of African Americans compared to the unemployment rates of whites, and this chart goes from the years of 1950-ish to about present day. And what we can see is really there's kind of there's a very steady gap in unemployment that hasn't changed at all. The difference is still about twice the unemployment rate for blacks as it is for whites, which is kind of a shame that after 60 years we haven't made much progress. Additionally, 1 in 3 African American children is born to parents with incomes below the poverty line, which is always just a terrible statistic to have. And then on this chart on the left, this really kind of looks at the wealth gap. So as we can see in a chart from 1966 to 2010, it's a graph of the black and white at median incomes, and as we can see, the whites is always substantially larger than the blacks. But however, we can look at this ratio of that kind of says the ratio between black incomes to white incomes, and as we can see, over this period of 50 years, it has really just remained constant, which shows that economically not much has changed or really improved since the 60s. Okay, so now that we've addressed the issue of economics, let's look at how education is, there's a huge divide in education. So what we've seen over the past 20 years or so is that American schools are becoming increasingly resegregated. So how did this all take place? Because we all know Brown v. Board was a Kickstarter to integrate schools. But during the Reagan era and the Bush era, a lot of Supreme Court justices turned very conservative. And so we get these cases like in Milliken v. Bradley, where school integration was substantially curbed. So now prosecutors can no longer just point to the fact that there is desegregation in schools, and that automatically leads to discrimination. They now had to prove that laws actually were intended to cause discrimination, which was a monumental task for prosecutors. And then in San Antonio Independent School District versus Rodriguez, the courts held that inequalities in school funding did not necessarily deny the Equal Protection Amendment, of the Constitution. So what that means is that typically suburban, affluent white neighborhoods could fund their own schools in their neighborhoods, and then poor inner city communities were forced to somehow fund their own schools, and of course the funding would be drastically different, but this is ruled constitutional under the Supreme Court. And so finally, in the 1990s, the Supreme Court kind of effectively ended its desegregation orders. I think the most well-known case for this is Missouri versus Jenkins, where the court ended the desegregation orders for Kansas City schools. And an interesting statistic to note is that immediately afterwards, the percentage of students attending schools with large black enrollment declined about by half, from 45% to 22%, and it's been dropping ever steadily. And then really, these three cases and many others, they really turned back the substantial integration progress after Brown v. Board. And today we see that schools are shockingly more segregated today than in 1968, and there's major funding differences that exist for schools in affluent suburban neighborhoods versus poor inner city neighborhoods, and it's really just a shame. So another issue with the educational gap is that there's some pretty large disparities in primary and secondary school funding. So across the country, a majority white schools, which is about 90% of white students, they spend about $730 more per student than majority non-white schools, with about 90% of their population not being white. And then what I have here on the bottom is I have a graph that depicts the percentage of 30-year-olds with a college degree over the past 40 years. And so I regret that I couldn't get the axes labeled on there, but the bottom, the purple, is a picture of African Americans who are 30-year-olds and their percentages who have a college degree. And I know you can't really see this, but that percentage kind of today at the end of the graphs caps around about 20%. And then the one on the top with the white line is for white people, and that kind of caps off right now today at about 35%. So some pretty huge differences that really haven't kind of lessened over the years. Now I'm also going to talk a little bit about some disparities in the criminal justice system. I'm just going to mention these briefly because a little bit later on in my essay I'm going to talk about them too. But just kind of to give you a general introduction into kind of how large these differences are, a black male born today would have a 32% chance of going to prison. And although whites and blacks use drugs at equal rates, blacks are jailed for drug charges 10 times more often, and African Americans are 3 times more likely to be arrested for pot smoking. And then I know this last part is cut off, so I'm just going to read it to you out loud. Unfortunately, all this disproportionate jailings and arrests, they pose further barriers to housing, employment, and social standing when future employers or homeowners will run background checks on these people. And then they're unable to secure housing, and it's just a vicious downward cycle. And I guess on that note, this kind of ends my multimedia presentation. I just wanted to say one more thing, because I know we've had a pretty heavy focus on music in this class, and I think there's a really interesting component to music and how music can relate to the present day culture at the time, because we know that music just doesn't come out of anywhere. It's really derived from the thoughts and feelings of people who lived in society. So music is a great way to get a very personal, in-depth look at society at the time. So one of the most famous kind of rap groups was NWA, and in 1986 they formed. And they released a song called Fuck the Police a couple years later. And while I'm not going to play it here for obvious reasons, I think it's a really interesting song that kind of directly addresses, a lot of the African American perception of police in their society and roaming in their streets. And I think it's a really good song to look at because it ties in nicely with this idea of how music it kind of can give us a glimpse into the culture and the times. So with that, thank you for listening to my multimedia presentation, and I hope you enjoy the rest of my essay.